Now we have the first conference. Professor Guillaume Fréchette, Universität Salzburg. Verities of Scientific Philosophy, German versus Austro-German philosophy. Professor.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Pedro, for thank you for the kind invitation to speak here in Sao Paulo, to Mario for putting up this very stimulating event on the origins of contemporary philosophy, and also to all the members of the research group Origens da Filosofia Contemporánea. So what I want to do today is to discuss in a very broad perspective this distinction between so-called German philosophy and Austro-German philosophy, and especially regarding their respective conceptions of scientific philosophy. So perhaps I'll just sorry for this. Okay. So here's basically what I want to do. So first I will give louder. Okay. Is it better now? Okay, good. So first I will give a general presentation of what I take to be 5 of the most important views or central views in the scientific philosophy, or in the historiography of scientific philosophy or philosophies in the 19th and 20th century in German-speaking countries. Then I will go on presenting some of their application, or what I call their mapping, some mapping proposals, and some of the problems related to these mapping proposals. And then I will sketch my own proposal among these 5 different views. So basically my strategy, or my hint on this topic or on this problem, is to start by finding moments of unity. So I'll be a little bit more explicit on this, and I will build these moments of unities from some case studies in order to understand this distinction perhaps in a better way. So there are, of course, more than 5 views on the history of scientific philosophy in German-speaking countries between the 19th and the 20th century. But I think more or less there are 5 important views that we find in the literature on this period of the history of philosophy. So first, there is this what I would call the Kantian account. So you perhaps may not agree with me on the appropriateness of the label, but I think it's just for the sake of simplicity quite telling. So the Kantian account is basically the idea that the 19th century philosophy in German language countries, or German-speaking countries, was driven by more or less what we could call a Kantian epistemology. So people like Hermann Lotze, Wilhelm Windelband, but also Cohen and Nathorp in philosophy, but also people like Helmholtz and Wundt in physiology and psychology, respectively, were sharing some part of a set of common convictions that are all in some sense related with Kantian epistemology about how to conduct scientific research. And it ends, according to this view or this account, it ends more or less with the critique of scientific philosophy. And so one moment that is so characteristic for this last term, or this final moment of scientific philosophy, is the critique of it by, for example, Husserl, and also by Heidegger on a different level. So, and then the end of the 19th-20th century scientific philosophy in a German-speaking country, according to this Kantian account, would lead more or less to what we call continental philosophy. So it would start then with this conference by Heidegger in 1928, or with this event in Davos between Cassirer, Heidegger, and Carnap. So, and this was also Michael Friedman's suggestion, that before Davos there was no such split, so between analytic and continental philosophy. So German speaking, or the Kantian account, so to speak, would basically reconstruct this history of 19th, 20th century scientific philosophy as ending more or less around 1928, or depending on the views around 1933, 34, or 36. And that would lead to this official split between analytic and continental philosophy, German philosophy being in this sense leading, so to speak, to continental philosophy. So we see this kind of account, of course, with nuance and with varieties, and also in other authors, not only in Friedman. I think people like Christian Könke, Herbert Schnedelbach, but also in the field of perception science, someone like Gary Hadfield, are defending similar views. So as a chapter of 19th and 20th century philosophy in German-speaking countries, the history of scientific philosophy is generally told in the same way. So, as I said, in the case of Schnedelbach or Könke, but also in the case of Hadfield, so the development of perception sciences in 19th century starts more or less from Kant and goes up to Helmholtz. So this is a kind of a Kantian line. So this is, perhaps we could argue that there are differences here in the view, and that they are not all, that they do not all agree on all the elements. But I think more or less they agree with this Kantian epistemology in a loose sense, at least. But there's this other view by Richardson. So Richardson is quite near, in my view, to people like Hadfield, to people like Friedman, but he has perhaps a more liberal use of the term scientific philosophy, and that leads to a different account. So he characterizes this period as the era of new scientific philosophy view. So in his paper on history of scientific philosophy of 1997. So, as I said, it's a more general or more nuanced view. So according to Richardson, scientific philosophy defined itself via criticisms of old-fashioned systematic metaphysics, and in the 20th century of Lebensphilosophie. It offered a modernist vision of philosophy, participating in a progressive, problem-solving, piecemeal, and collaborative scientific ethos. So who are these people, according to Richardson? So, well, he quotes, of course, different authors, but he would put more or less in the same bag people like Helmholtz, like Avenarius, Husserl, Russell, Carnap, Neurath, Heidegger. So perhaps with the exception of Husserl, there are not so many Austrians in that, but it doesn't matter here at this point. So it's a kind of, we could say, more or less ecumenical view of how scientific philosophy was done in the 19th, 20th century. So Richardson doesn't put much emphasis on schools, but on similar attempts as toward problem solving. So they were looking at specific problems. They were developing different solutions, but not because they were belonging to a school, but because they were involved in that collaborative scientific ethos. Okay, so in Richardson's view, the analytic continental divide does not, as we understand it today, does not take correctly into account the development of scientific philosophy in the 19th, 20th century. And I think that's perhaps one central element in Richardson's view, and one which in my view is problematic, is that, so he really stresses the point that at this time, so between 1850 and 1940, what he called the era of new scientific philosophy, Wissenschaft in German had a broader meaning than science as we understand the term today. So in this sense, and this is an important thesis to support this collaborative scientific ethos view, in this sense, Helmholtz, Avenarius, Husserl, Russell, Carnap, Neurath, and Heidegger contributed to scientific philosophy in this broader meaning. So this is the second view, which I think is also influential, but also representative of many other philosophers' views. So another view which was popular, I think, in the 1990s, but which has been which is not so much discussed anymore, is the semantic tradition view that Alberto Coffa proposed in his posthumous book on the semantic tradition from Kant to Carnap. So Coffa has an interesting perspective, because what he's doing is not trying to give a general account as people like Schnedelbach would do, or as people like Friedman, or even Richardson, but he's trying to start from some, what I call here, moment of unity. So there is a red thread, so to speak, in 19th and 20th century philosophy, and there are perhaps many red threads, but one of these threads is the semantic tradition. So, and it goes from Bolzano, Frege, Russell, Helmholtz, Poincaré, Hilbert, Husserl, and Wittgenstein. And it's basically developed, according to Coffa, because epistemology with and after Kant was in a state of disarray due primarily to semantic neglect. So this is the main, the main feature of the semantic tradition, and this is also what distinguishes the red thread of the semantic tradition from other threads. So there's the fourth view now, which I personally, I'm perhaps a little bit closer, but I am also critical of this view, and it is the view defended by Barry Smith, that if we want to talk about scientific philosophy in the 19th and 20th century, then we should talk only about Austrian philosophy, because there is no German scientific philosophy. So this was basically Barry Smith's view in his book on Austrian philosophy. So I'm quoting him because I think it's quite a strong thesis, so it's worth noting that he actually says that. So the relation of philosophy to matter of scientifically established fact is in post-Kantian German philosophy not normally a subject for investigation. Certainly there are exceptions, for example Bauch, Natop, or Cassirer, but these are only exceptions, and again are overwhelmingly thinkers outside the mainstream of German philosophy. So Bauch, Natop, and Cassirer didn't really belong to the mainstream German philosophy. So they were doing perhaps scientific philosophy, but this is the exception that confirms the rule. And in this light, it is especially significant that the contributions of philosophically minded mathematicians such as Frege and Hilbert were received not by German philosophers, but by philosophers in England or Poland. And Smith lays his card on the table relatively quickly, so in the introduction, so by saying, around the turn of our present century, this immanentistic mode of philosophizing was subjected to attack from two quarters. So in the Anglo-Saxon world, above all in the Cambridge of Russell and Moore, and in Austria by philosophers in the Brentano school. It is in this connection that we shall justify our claim that it is Brentano and his followers who constitute the central axis of Austrian philosophy. So there is, of course, an alternative to these very radical views or less radical views, such as Richardson and perhaps also Coffa in some sense. And there's an interesting alternative here, especially because his author is among us today. It is the sociology of philosophical knowledge view, so by Martin Kusch. So I will not be discussing the view here because, or I will just be mentioning it because it involves a more detailed discussion about sociological aspects, which I'm not involved, which I will not be doing here. But it's worth mentioning because it's a view which is quite apart from all other views that I presented. So Martin writes, the alleged autonomy of philosophical standards cannot be taken for granted, but must be questioned as to how it is achieved, what forms of knowledge it is taught to exclude, and why it is accorded any special value in the first place. It might seem at the first glance, that the view is not really philosophically involved, so or that it is one could say, neutral. But so Martin says it is not necessarily philosophically irrelevant or not necessarily neutral. The sociological study of philosophy is potentially made of the very stuff of which the central philosophical questions are made. So the sociology of philosophical knowledge is an eminently philosophical project. So perhaps if we want to represent ourselves the spectrum of these views, we could put eventually the Kantian on the left side and the Austrian view on the right side. So these would be so extreme left and extreme right. So depending on where you stand, this is a good or bad connotation, but I'm not meaning anything, I'm not connoting here anything, although the colors are perhaps a little bit suggestive. So the Kantian view, the red view, is, so to speak, on the extreme left, and then there's this new era view by Richardson, and then there's a kind of switch when we go to the perspective developed by Koffa, the perspective taking these moments of unity, so looking at red threads. And there's a radicalization of this view, I think, in Barry Smith's book, where the Austrian view, where there is basically no German scientific philosophy, and so sociology of philosophical knowledge view is, so to speak, aside, or take a stance so that allows itself not to get engaged with any of these views, but also to address the exact same polemics or debates that these views are addressing. So, in a sense, the sociology of philosophical knowledge takes a metaphilosophical stance on these views, but I think, or it's my impression, as all metaphilosophical stance, it remains neutral on the value of the views at stake. So perhaps one way, so this is the spectrum I will be discussing today, and I will be focusing perhaps more on the Austrian part of the spectrum, but one way to perhaps get a grip on this spectrum and how it actually works, or it is actually structured, is to take as a methodological aid the distinction between realism and anti-realism. I don't want here to say that views belonging to the Kantian or to the new era views are anti-realistic views, or are by definition anti-realistic views, or that the others are by definition realistic views. But I think it helps us to understand how this spectrum is structured. So there is perhaps a realistic affinity on the side of Austrian and semantic views, and I think there is an anti-realistic affinity on the other side. So these are the 5 views that I wanted to present first, and then I'll go on discussing the application of these views, and perhaps pointing also at the problems that these applications are involving. So when you look at the Kantian view on the history of scientific philosophy in the 19th and 20th century, so I think German philosophy leads in this view, or in one application of the view, and especially in Schnedelbach, it leads to continental philosophy. So Schnedelbach says, okay, what was the concern in 19th century philosophy? Well, he answers then, what is philosophy in post-idealistic times, and how is such a thing possible? So basically, according to him, all these philosophers, including Helmholtz and all the neo-Kantians, were just basically addressing the question of the conditions of possibility of this of scientific philosophy. So they were basically formulating these Kantian questions. And perhaps for Kantian reasons, then the development of something like psychology for Schnedelbach is something that happened outside philosophy. So Schnedelbach cannot account at all for the development of psychology, and this is an incredible consequence in his book. And so we find very strange remarks regarding psychology or psychology of values in the book, where he writes something like, psychology in the 19th century is not a philosophical discipline anymore. So, okay, why? It's not clear. But an experiential scientific one. Therefore, psychologizing, psychologisierende theoreticians such as Meinong, Ehrenfeld, Münsterberg, Stern are not considered here. So the complete ignorance of the role of psychology for the shaping of philosophy, especially in the second part of the 19th century, cannot be simply ignorance, I think. It is the sheer blindness to reality, which is characteristic of most post-Kantian philosophers in the second half of the 19th century, were blindly following Kant on the impossibility for psychology to become a science. So psychology, in this Kantian approach of the history of philosophy in 19th and 20th century, is just basically reiterating this Kantian attitude towards psychology, which I really cannot understand. So, in short, it seems that the Schnedelbach is having the following thought. So Austrian philosophers are all, in fact, psychologistic agitators. So this is a very, perhaps, caricatural reconstruction of his argument, but I think it's basically what he wants to say. Psychologism, second, psychologism is not philosophy, or if it's only bad philosophy, but you can also argue that bad philosophy is not philosophy. So therefore, there is no Austrian philosophy. And by extension, the late Husserl and Heidegger's rejection of scientific views of the world concludes the chapter of 19th century German scientific philosophy and paves the way to the continental philosophy of the 20th century. So this is a reconstruction where we're really following one thread, which I think is not representative of all German scientific philosophy or all Austro-German and German scientific philosophy. And we build, so to speak, in our way of doing history of philosophy, we build the very same presuppositions that the philosophers we're talking about were using. And that leads to, in my view, an opinionated, to say the least, an opinionated reconstruction of the history of German philosophy. It's basically the same attitude that we find in Windelband in 1883 in his Präludien, where he writes, "We who philosophize in the 19th century, we are all pupils of Kant, as in alle Schüler von Kant." So that makes it quite difficult, so to speak, when you want to do an history of philosophy to start with this presupposition. And we find it also in many Kant scholars that are interested in today in Husserl or in Brentano or in what I call the Austrian traditions. We find it, for example, in Robert Hanna, who's discussing Brentano from a strictly Kantian point of view. So this is a quote, I think, which is representative of this kind of approach. For Brentano, the act of intentionality literally contains its intentional objects as intrinsic contents. Consequently, an intentional object cannot also exist outside the mind as a thing in itself. It is therefore equivalent to what Kant called an appearance, an Erscheinung. So it seems for taking this perspective that we will just reconstruct everything from this period in Kantian terms, and I think it is a too strong reduction, simply. But so there's a British joke about German philosophy, or a British-Irish joke about German philosophy, so namely that you can trace all good things in German philosophy back to Austrian philosophy. So, but I think, I mean, I like that kind of joke, but I think it holds, unfortunately, also for some of the bad things. And here, for the idea that there is no Austrian philosophy, which was, so far as I can tell, an Austrian invention. So in 1922, so the Kantian view is not a strictly German view, so to speak. We had people like Robert Reininger, who were explicitly, so an Austrian, who was explicitly defending this thesis in 1922. So in 22, he became president of the Philosophische Gesellschaft an der Universität zu Wien. And so we could we could consider him, this is perhaps not a very good comparison or a very flattering comparison, as the philosophical precursor of Schuschnigg. So Schuschnigg was the one who was head of the Austrian state at the time of the annexion in 1938. So Reininger says the following thing in his in an allocution in 1929, when we decided 2 years ago to become a local group of the Kant Society, the decision grew out of the high esteem that we held for the greatest philosophical association in Germany and the aspiration to formally join the great community of all German friends of philosophy. This community has actually always existed. There is not, and so this is a quite strong thesis, there is not and has never been a specifically Austrian philosophy for which I should account, but only a German philosophy in which we Austrians participate. So you see that, well, this event that the Philosophical Society and, at the University of Vienna turned to a satellite of the Kant Gesellschaft. This event is quite important when we want to understand how the Vienna Circle developed, or the Ernst Mach Verein developed, because people like Neurath, then after this break of the Philosophische Gesellschaft, found the motivation to have their own philosophical society, which was then the Ernst Mach Verein. But it's quite a symbolic moment, because the Philosophical Society at the University of Vienna was founded by the students of Brentano, by Hans Schmidt-Kunz and Alois Höfler. And the aim of this society was precisely to work in a kind of community with scientific research, people working on physiology, people working on psychiatry, people working in physics. People like Boltzmann also gave talks there. Meinert, who's a psychiatrist, and of course Brentano himself, but also historians. Gompertz was there, Zimmermann was there. So it was really a very pluralist society, and certainly not Kantian in spirit. So at the time when Reininger decided to, as a chair of the society, decided to break down the society or to just give it, so to speak, to the Germans, to the Kant Gesellschaft. So it marks, so to speak, a quite important moment. So, but what I want to say with this event around 1922 is that even from the side of the so-called Austrians, so the philosophers who geographically belong to Austria, even from their perspective, at least for some of them, there is no Austrian philosophy. And I must confess that some people in my department in Salzburg also believe that today. But I will not go into the details, and I will not name names. So, well, this is just a further quote from Reininger's text, because this Anschluss, Anspielung is also there, so I just wanted to quote it, but it gives us also, it reflects, I think, somehow the state of mind that some Austrian philosophers had at that time. So in this respect, writes Reininger, the annexion to the Kant Gesellschaft also held special symbolic significance for us. Of course, philosophy is not a national matter, but concerns humanity as a whole. But for us, Austrians, this close alliance with the greatest association of German philosophers represent more than a simple community of practical work. And now it becomes political. It is primarily a testimony to our inseparable spiritual and cultural belonging to the German people, and therefore not only a simple question of convenience, but more importantly still, it represents a little step on the path of the realization of an ideal that is alive in all Austrians. So this is just here a small point to show that, or to suggest at least, that the kind of view defended by people like Schneidelbach is not so easily defeated from a strictly historical perspective, because there were people in the 1920s from Austria who were actually believing more or less the same thing as Schneidelbach is believing. So now, as a further application, as an application of the Austrian view, I think we can also consider what Michael Dummett is doing in his Origins of Analytical Philosophy. So Dummett, as most of you certainly know, has this conception that analytic and continental philosophy should be somehow considered as the Danube and the Rhine. So they both have their source in Germany or in Austria or in South Germany, but they flow at some point in different directions. So Austrian philosophy is, so to speak, the common source of phenomenology, or continental philosophy by extension, and analytic philosophy. But after the linguistic turn, so they just split apart. So what we should do, according to Dummett, is to go back to this point where they were, so to speak, united. So, but there are problems, I think, with this kind of Austrian view, as Dummett, as Dummett defends. I think Dummett sees in anti-psychologism a kind of defining moment, and he sees also in the concern with Sinn, or intentional content, a defining moment of what the Austrian tradition has to offer in analytic philosophy. But I think it is simply not a defining moment of unity in Austrian philosophy. It also has a double normative dimension. So we should come back to linguistic analysis in order to avoid bad phenomenology, which is transcendental phenomenology, but also to avoid bad analytic philosophy. And one of the examples he's giving, I think, is Garrett Evans. So I think the application of what I call the Austrian view, the application of this view that we find in Dummett, is still very problematic, because we're using moments of unity that seem to be strictly chosen for very specific reasons. So it has an ideological touch, which I think is very hardly defendable in the history of philosophy. So another application of the Austrian view is what Neurath does in the Wissenschaftliche Auffassung in 1929, but we also find similar elements in Einheitswissenschaft und Psychologie of 1933. So the basic idea behind Neurath's reconstruction is that Ernst Mach's anti-metaphysical attitude seduced the members of the Vienna Circle, and the influence, so this is taken from Barry Smith's reconstruction, but the influence of Mach and Boltzmann makes it understandable why there was in Vienna a lively dominant interest in the epistemological and logical problems linked to the foundations of physics. So the kind of account, so if you have in mind this kind of little story of the Vienna Circle that Neurath gives in the Wissenschaftliche Weltauffassung, this kind of account is difficult to understand. I mean, the anti-metaphysical perspective or conviction is certainly one of the features of Austrian philosophy, but it's certainly also, in this case, not a defining feature. It may apply to a lot of Austrians, but it would be hard to say that it applies, for example, to Bolzano. And Bolzano had a metaphysical conception, a conception of metaphysics. He was doing metaphysics. He was not an anti-metaphysician. Brentano himself was a metaphysician and defended also views on the nature of substance. He was not involved in the kind of project that Mach was considering very seriously. And what should we say about Meinong? Meinong was developing this Gegenstandstheorie in a metaphysically quite loaded way, so he was not very economical on this view, and he was not trying to overcome metaphysics or to be anti-metaphysic in his perspective. So I think here again, the application of this strong view that I presented as Barry Smith's view, but it's not necessarily his view. I think it is a view that is shared by many other philosophers, among other Neurath, but applying this view and doing history of philosophy, as does Neurath, is, I think, quite problematic. Another application that we find is made by Rudolf Haller, and it was also quite influential, and it is also an interesting application of the Austrian view and further development of Neurath's view. It's basically the following idea. So this is taken from Haller's seminal paper. Haller writes, "I wish to defend two theses. First, that in the last 100 years there has taken place an independent development of a specifically Austrian philosophy opposed to the philosophical currents in the remainder of the German-speaking world. And secondly, that this development can sustain a genetic model which permits us to affirm an intrinsic homogeneity of Austrian philosophy up to the Vienna Circle and its descendant." So according to Haller, the birth of Austrian philosophy can be traced back to the publication of Brentano's Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint in 1874. But why is that so? So Brentano's philosophical program was already announced in the fourth thesis of the habilitation. Vera philosophiae methodus nulla alia nisi scientiae naturalis est. What was at stake was the rejection of the Kantian distinction between empirical and transcendental methods, according to Haller, and that scientific standards should, at all events, be retained. So what distinguishes, in Haller's view, the methodology of Brentano and makes it capable of further development is the research rule, or as one would say, the research program, in a Lacatosian sense, which underlines it. So Haller agrees with Neurath on the anti-metaphysical attitude, but provides what he calls a genetic account of the unity, which gives us, so to speak, a way of explaining how that Austrian philosophy, the whole Austrian philosophy came about. So Haller's perspective is somehow, I think, what I would call an appropriationist perspective in history of philosophy. What I mean by this is that there are different accounts of how we should conduct the history of philosophy. So one way to characterize the spectrum is to divide between contextualists, people that are just trying to understand what was the context that gave rise to specific theses that they are studying. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have people that we could characterize as appropriationists, in the sense that they will look at history of philosophy from the perspective of their own concerns, and they will try to get thesis, ideas, reflections, or to use polemics in order to alimент their own philosophical practice. So it seems, in some sense, I think that Haller is also working in that way. So this is also another quote, which I think gives us a description of what he's after. So the investigation, writes Haller, of a school tradition reduces in the end to the simple problem of giving a genetic account of a phenomenon of the history of ideas which both determine and bear fruit in present-day thinking. But let us turn to the question of historical legitimation, back to the problem of our own time. Even if we are aware that no claims as to the truths of ideas can be derived from genetic considerations, still they occasionally help us to achieve a shift of the aspect in which thoughts, arguments, and theories are experienced. So in other words, the shift of the aspect, as Haller says, which happened in 1874 in Brentano's Psychology, was the focus made on philosophy conducted as a scientific discipline. So another application of this Austrian view, of Barry Smith's Austrian view, is just to say, well, we don't have here necessarily in what would consist in Austrian philosophy, we don't have here necessarily specific theses as to the nature of being, as to the nature as to the importance of metaphysics or things like this, but we have perhaps a thesis that we could call a style or rigor or professionalism. So the criteria, so to speak, the identification criteria is rather on this level. So Austrian philosophy, so to simplify a bit his account, is at the end of the day something like a matter of style. It is a sober scientific style, and it has shun pretensions. And in this sense, and so Smith is also rejecting this geographical characterization of Austrian philosophy. So Austrian philosophy, the expression Austrian philosophy, is a misnomer to the degree that it suggests erroneously that there is a corresponding sectarian or regional or ethnic philosophy. For Austrian philosophy is philosophy per se, part and parcel of the mainstream of world philosophy. It is that part of German language philosophy which meets international standards of rigor, professionalism, and specialization. So I think, and I probably evoked some of these problems already, but I think there are numerous problems with the accounts I presented. Now, I'm not applying these problems to the fifth view because I didn't discuss the fifth view, namely the sociology of philosophical knowledge, but at least the four first views that I presented now, and their application especially. I think that the first problem, or the main problem, is that they are silent about their own stance towards what philosophy generally should be. So they never tell us what philosophy in general should be. They take it as granted, but they are so doing history of philosophy without mentioning their own stance towards it. So I think this kind of attitude has the following result. So it leads to a blind spot in most of these views, the views discussed just a moment ago, and with some exceptions, it leads to the result that the views are mostly incommensurable. So it leads to the result that when you compare the two extremes of the spectrum, the Schnedelbach's view and let's say Barry Smith's view, as a neutral observer, when you start doing history of philosophy comparing these views, well, you think, oh, well, they are talking about completely different things. So if they are not talking about completely different things, then the views are obviously incommensurable because they see very different things, or they see these things as being in very different configurations. And it leads, I think, in some of the views and in some of the applications that I presented to astonishing deformations of basic bibliographical reality. I think it is the case of Schnedelbach. I mean, you have to bear in mind that this is a book of history of philosophy, and if you just dismiss, let's say, half a library of books because they simply don't have the title philosophy into it, or because they don't use enough Kantian vocabulary, it is hard to take this as a very concerned historical research. I think it is. I mean, if it is the case, it is an astonishing deformation of what we're doing in philosophy or in history of philosophy. And some are simply negationists, and this is the case of Reiniger. This is just a basic case of negationism in history of philosophy. So in short, the line between history of philosophy and ideology tends to disappear. So when we consider all these four views, so what should we do? So if we don't want to get into ideology, or if we don't want to blur the line between what is, properly speaking, history of philosophy and what is, at the end of the day, some kind of ideology, then what should we do? So I don't have a very well-formed proposal. What I have in mind is a sketch of a proposal, and I think could be so generally described as finding some moments of unity with further specifications. And I insist here on moments of unity because I think that some of the perspectives that I presented have this feature. Like you look at what Barry Smith is doing, and not inventing the wheel here. Barry Smith has also this perspective, and of course Alberto Coffa has it as well. But what I try to do is to try to find more of these moments of unity and to add further specification in order to describe what an history of 19th or 20th century philosophy should do in order to avoid the kind of ideology that I just presented. So, for the rest of the talk, I will basically present 7 case studies. I could have taken 14 or 15 or whatever, very much more than that. And my selection of these 7 cases is almost arbitrary, so I'm not following here a general picture that I'm trying to hide from you in order to prove something. I'm just picking, so what I take to be salient examples of the conflict between Austrian and German philosophy in regard to what scientific philosophy is. So it's in some sense, well, these case studies are in some sense studies of polemics or debates. And the first one is probably the most important one, is the debate or the polemic between Bolzano and Kant. So we find in this book by Prihonsky of 1850, a very interesting and systematic a critique of the pure reason of Kant. And Prihonsky was a student of Bolzano, so he developed his thesis based on Bolzano's idea in the theory of science. And so the criticisms or the point of conflict that I will present here are taken sometimes from Bolzano himself, sometimes from Prihonsky. So and just another precision here on what I'm doing. I don't want here to take necessarily a stance on who's right on the debate between Bolzano and Kant, or who's right in the debate between the further figures that I will be discussing. I just want to expose these case studies in order to see the strategy behind what the authors are doing. And I think we will find eventually, looking at these case studies, similar strategies. And these are, I think, the moments of unity that I'm looking for. So Bolzano has, of course, many things to say against Kant and against, for example, his distinction between intuition and concept. So Kant says basically something like this: intuition gives its object immediately. It has only one object in its extension, but it is not simple, so it has a composed intention. So Bolzano argues against Kant here by pointing at this flaw in Kant's reflection. We can conclude from this that an intuition gives us one object, but we can't conclude from this that concepts are therefore only mediate. So we shouldn't confuse the distinction between mediate and immediate with the distinction between intuition and concepts. So another point of criticism, which is also very well known, is Bolzano's critique of Kant's analytic distinction, analytic and synthetic distinction. So, of course, the critique is quite complicated. There are possible objections to this critique, and I will not be discussing them. What I want to do, as I already said, is just to show the case in order for you and for us to take the feature of, or to take the defining feature of the strategy used by Bolzano against Kant. So Bolzano's point against Kant in its distinction is that Kant's definition is too large. A proposition expressed by the father of Alexander, king of Macedonia, was king of Macedonia, is analytic by Kant's light, since inclusion. Since its conception of analyticity is the inclusion of the predicate in the subject. So this conception is just too imprecise. If it gives us so to speak, such sentences as analytic sentences. And look also at his attack against Kant concerning categories. So Bolzano says, Kant says that categories are concept of an object in general, but he has no definitions of what categories are. So how is the concept of relation, for example, distinct from the concept of a chair? So these are, we could see it as local critics or local criticisms or local objections to Kant's theory, and I think they display a feature that we will find also in other of these polemics between Austrians and Germans. So the second case study that I think is here interesting is the debate between Hering and Helmholtz on the nature of spatial perception. So Helmholtz was a student of Johannes Müller, and Müller had this important thesis in 1837, the thesis about specific nerve energies. So Müller's thesis is that every sensory nerve reacts specifically to a stimulus S. So the consequence, or the philosophical consequence of this thesis, is that sensory perception is not of a quality of external body, but it is actually of a quality of our nerves. So if there is a specific reaction to a certain stimulus, a specific nervous reaction to a certain stimulus, then what we call sensory perception has to do with the quality of the nerves, and it doesn't have to do with the quality of external bodies. So this was basically Müller's work in 1837. A student of Müller, perhaps his best known student, was Hermann Helmholtz, and he developed, of course, on the basis of Müller's idea, his theory of perception. So contents of sensations, so, says Helmholtz, are signs which completely depends upon our organization. So what it implies, what this implies in Helmholtz's conception of sensation is that we should distinguish between sensations and perception. These are two different processes, suggests Helmholtz. So the sensation is produced by the stimulation of the specific nerve. And perception is this second step in the general process of perception, one could say, where we interpret the sensation as giving us information on localization. So what Helmholtz is doing with by introducing this conception of perception is adapting in physiology Kant's thesis on the speciality of as outer form of our intuition. So there is no space, so to speak, outside our perception, and perception means simply the interpretation of the signs. So it is, I think Helmholtz was very influential for many neo-Kantians, because he had also here a physiological thesis explaining the more abstract thesis of Kant about the nature of spatiality. So Hering opposed to Helmholtz in what was around the 1850s labeled as a debate between nativism and empiricism. So Helmholtz was an empiricist. Hering was labeled as a nativist. So Hering replies here to Helmholtz basically by saying that sensations are not unorganized raw material. Space is a primitive quality of what is given in sensations. And one of the examples that Hering uses is the following one. So we see the trees, for example, in a row of trees as being bigger from a short distance. So the first tree here that you're seeing, and shorter from a long distance. But we think them as being of relatively equal length. So I think this description, Hering and Helmholtz would agree with this description. This is the first step. But the second step is where they disagree, is that characterizing this thinking as a perception, as Helmholtz does, implies a purely hypothetical thought-like process. And this is where Helmholtz introduces these unconscious inferences. So the Hering-Helmholtz case displays, I think, another feature of the distinction between Germans and Austro-Germans. It is not a defining feature, but it is both an anti-Kantian and what I would call another feature, which I would call the ontological or the Austrian ontological parsimony. So the Austrian parsimony is, of course, the thesis that you shouldn't postulate any entity beyond necessity. And the Austrian adaptation of this criteria is that you should not postulate anything or any entity which is not experienceable without necessity. And I think that's basically the strategy that Hering is developing, and it is also a strategy that we will find in Brentano and in many psychologists from Brentano school. So let's go to the third case now, and this is a case which pertains to economy or the science of economy, but which is also closely connected with philosophy. So this is der alte Methodenstreit between Karl Menger and Schmoller. So just in order to give a quick reminder, following Schmoller, Schmoller is main representative of the historical school of economics, but also following people like Dilthey and also in history, people like Droysen, there are no unchangeable laws of human actions. And the object of national economy is society as a whole, and the processes therein are relative to time and space. So Menger opposed to this account of to this historical account of value, that value as determined, so to speak, historically, already in his Grundsätze of 1871, and he developed what we call an individualist conception of value. So in opposition to the collectivist conception of values that we find in the historical school. So for Menger, I'll quote in German, but I'll give an English approximation. A value is die Bedeutung, welche konkrete Güter oder Güterquantitäten für uns dadurch erlangen, dass wir in der Befriedigung unserer Bedürfnisse von der Verfügung über dieselben abhängig zu sein uns bewusst sind. So, a value, this is more or less what the definition means in English. Value is the meaning that goods acquire for us in consideration, so dabei bewusst zu sein, so to speak, in consideration of their capacity to fulfill our needs. And this capacity to fulfill our needs is what Menger labels the utility, so the Nützlichkeit. And the utility, Nützlichkeit, ist die Tauglichkeit eines Dinges der Befriedigung menschlicher Bedürfnisse zu dienen und demnach, und zwar die erkannte Nützlichkeit, eine allgemeine Voraussetzung der Güterqualität. So what we see here as a strategy, I mean, one should I should remind you here, it's written in 1871, so it was even before Brentano's psychology from an empirical standpoint, but it's basically the same strategy. So if we want to understand what value is, what the good is, what is truth, we should look at specific acts of consciousness, and in this case, at specific acts of valuing. This is the strategy developed by Menger. So for an object or an action to be good, according to Menger, there must be a need. The object must possess properties able to fulfill the need, and the connection must be known, it must be bewusst. And this is also very important in Meinong's later account of Urteilsgefühle. Meinong studied with Menger at the same time as he studied with Brentano, and adapted, so to speak, is both these thinkers in his own theory of values and in his own psychology. And of course, the object must be available. So Schmoller, in a series of paper, couldn't simply do with that kind of account. of course, I mean, the debate is very complex, and it's especially in 1883, when Dilthey publishes his Einleitung in die Geisteswissenschaften. Of course, Dilthey was an ally of Schmoller. Menger published at the same time his Untersuchungen in die Sozialwissenschaften, and here the positions or the conflict is developed in a more detailed way. But basically, these two schools were opposed, of course. So this is the third case, and I think we could, of course, and we should perhaps say that Brentano is certainly the axis in Austrian philosophy, but even this, when we see that Menger developed his idea quite independently of the school of Brentano. They were quite similar indeed. And later, of course, Menger realized that Brentano was teaching for some time at the same university as he was, and so they started to read Brentano, but this is a later story. But what I want to say is that, well, the axis, the Brentano axis is important, but it's not giving the full picture of what was actually going on between Austrian scientific philosophy and German scientific philosophy. So let's go now to the fourth case study, and this is, I think, an important issue in scientific philosophy. It is the opposition between Brentano and Wundt. So Brentano is, I think, well known for most of you. In 1866, presented these 25 habilitation theses. So we generally focus, when we say that Brentano was an advocate of scientific philosophy, we generally focus on the thesis 4, that the methods of philosophy are nothing else than those of natural sciences. And it fits well, of course, with what will be later developed in the Vienna Circle, and even someone like Richard von Mises puts this very thesis as an epigraph of his book on economy. So, although it was quite later, so almost 60 or 70 years later. So, of course, this is an important thesis in Brentano, but there are 25 other or 24 other theses that are very often not considered. So I think perhaps we should also consider this other thesis, the thesis number 1, which states that philosophy should reject the distinction between speculative and exact sciences, and this rejection is its condition of existence. So we generally don't consider this first thesis for a reason that I think it's probably right, but even if it's right, it doesn't exclude what I take to be the more interesting reading of this thesis. So at a first glance, it seems that Brentano is just simply saying, well, the kind of distinction that the idealists are doing is just totally unfruitful for the existence of philosophy as a science. And of course, I mean, he was addressing Hoffmann, who was a student of Schelling at that time in Würzburg, so it was also a kind of attack to idealism. This is true, I think, and this certainly makes sense. And in this sense, I think we can understand this thesis as directed against Schelling. But I think it has another meaning, which I think is, in this context, perhaps more interesting. It is directed against an understanding of the term exact in the sense of, or it could be directed against an understanding of exact in the sense of quantitative measurements. And we have this reflection in Brentano's metaphysics lectures that exact and speculative, in the sense of theoretical, speculative not in the sense used by the idealists, but in the sense in which Boëtius translated Aristotle's theoretikos into speculativus. So speculative is theoretical as opposed to practical. So an exact and speculative or theoretical science is no contradiction. So I think this is the main idea behind the thesis 1. And so if we combine now thesis 1 with thesis 4 is basically the idea that the methods of philosophy are nothing else than those of natural sciences. So it means basically that philosophy should use empirical methods. It should use observation, induction, and deduction. But the thesis 4 doesn't mean that all philosophical investigation, so every single investigation which belongs to philosophy, should be conducted with with the methods of natural science. And I think when we combine both theses, it leads more or less to the following idea, that philosophy as a science is empirical, and psychology by extension is empirical in the sense that it is inexact, as all empirical sciences are, because you're dealing with quantities, you're doing empirical observations, you don't have a priori laws, you have generalization. But it is, and it is an exact science because it is speculatively exact, like mathematics are exact. So this is, I think, Brentano's idea in 1866, and this is the idea which is behind the whole project of psychology as an empirical, from an empirical standpoint. And it helps us to understand what Brentano has to say against Wundt in the psychology from an empirical standpoint. So in the foreword to the psychology, he writes things like, our most urgent need in psychology is not the variety and the universality of the tenets, but rather the different perspectives or the different approaches or theories in psychology, but rather the unity of the doctrine. Within this framework, we must strive to attain what first mathematics and the physics, chemistry, and physiology have already attained, that is, a core of generally accepted truths capable of attracting to it contributions from all other fields of scientific endeavor. We must seek to establish a single unified science of psychology in place of the many psychologies we now have. So what are these many psychologies? So when Brentano is writing and preparing this psychology from an empirical standpoint, he had to deal with different versions or varieties of psychology which were dominant at that time, at least in Germany. Well, first the Herbartian psychology. Herbartian psychology was basically was based on the idea that psychological hypotheses should be verified by measures of magnitudes and mathematical calculus. So against Kant, psychology as a science is possible, and but then we should use exact measurements. So there should be something like mathematical calculus involved in psychology. And this idea is also, to some extent, present in Fechner. We find it also in Helmholtz's physiology, in Dubois-Reymond, in Johannes Müller. And I mean, the outcome of this tradition of doing exact psychology should be seen, in my view, in Wundt, in his theory of intensive magnitudes of psychological phenomena. So Brentano, of course, is... So if you have still in mind this unity of the thesis 1 and thesis 4 that I suggested, then you will probably be able to understand what Brentano's point against Wundt was. So Brentano writes, okay, so the exactness of psychology, so this is not from Brentano, the exactness of psychology, this is my point about unifying thesis 1 and thesis 4 in order to understand Wundt's, Brentano's critique to Wundt. The exactness of psychology doesn't come from its use of quantitative measurements for mental magnitudes, but can only come from exact theoretization or speculation, as he says in thesis 1, combined with inexact empirical scientific methods. So his point in psychology against Wundt is this one: I cannot in any way regard the existence of Wundt's so-called second dimension of mental phenomena as the condition which makes possible the scientific exactness of psychology. On the contrary, I think that it will be a great handicap to psychology and will make it completely impossible for the time being. And here, I think we can also see a further instance of this feature that I call the Austrian ontological parsimony. So what he argues against Wundt is that we shouldn't postulate these intensive magnitudes, which is a very problematic concept. If there is something that we can experience, and for example, the fact that when I am aware that I'm seeing, I can be wrong that I'm seeing the bottle, but I cannot be wrong that I'm seeing. We have here in inner observation or in inner perception, we have truths that are not defeasible. And using this kind of exactness combined with empirical methods is, so to speak, more economical than referring to mental magnitudes in order to justify psychology as a science. So this is basically, I think, Brentano's strategy against Wundt. So let's go now to the three last case studies, and I will finish then with these cases. So another case is a further development of the debate between Menger and Schmoller, and it's developed also in 1883 between Franz Hillebrand and Wilhelm Dilthey. So Hillebrand, this is also here, I think, another example of this of this attitude that Bolzano applies against Kant. And Hillebrand here plays exactly on the same tone as Bolzano when he argues against Kant. So in 1883, so Dilthey published this Einleitung in die Geisteswissenschaften, and Dilthey was, of course, an ally of Schmoller, and so Hillebrand felt the need, I don't know exactly why Hillebrand wrote this review of Dilthey, but he felt the need of so reacting to the historical school. So Hillebrand's point against Dilthey's Einleitung in die Geisteswissenschaften is that Dilthey doesn't offer any definition of the term he uses. So here you see the Bolzanian attitude. And when he claims to do so, they cannot count as definitions at all. So Dilthey verbindet mit gewissen Vorzügen, aber nicht jene Klarheit und Schärfe des Denkens, von der bei philosophischen Untersuchungen der Erfolg am wesentlichsten bedingt ist. So Dilthey is simply confused and unclear, so he's not using, or he's not a good example of someone who's using the virtues of clarity and exactness. So Dilthey's definition of science, so reformulated in Hillebrand's term or quoted by Hillebrand, goes approximately that way. Under science, says Dilthey, the common use of language, this is my translation of Sprachgebrauch, so der Sprachgebrauch, understands a set of propositions of which elements are concepts that is fully determined and constant in the whole context of thought, which investigates the connections in which, finally, the parts are connected with the goal of communication. And the sentence is not yet over, it's a complicated definition. Because either a constitutive part of reality is taught through this connection of sentences in its totality, or because a branch of the human activity is regulated by it. So Hillebrand spends 10 pages, perhaps we could consider this review as extremely mean in a sense, but I think it is also a fair review, because if someone has a definition of science, then if the definition is incorrect or problematic, it's perhaps mean in some sense to point at it, but it's certainly not unfair. So Hillebrand's point is that, well, this is simply not a definition. This is just a whole bunch of unclarities and errors, so eine Menge von Unklarheiten und Irrtümern. Against Sprachgebrauch, so Hillebrand points out, es ist nicht vielmehr sehr häufig vorgekommen, dass der gewöhnliche Sprachgebrauch, so when we refer to the common use of language in order to understand what science is, then we have a problem, because it happens a lot that der gewöhnliche Sprachgebrauch sogar Erscheinungen, die ohne jede wahre tiefere Verwandtschaft waren, zusammenfassen. So starting with Sprachgebrauch is certainly not the best bet that Dilthey had to take. So, and what does that mean, a set of sentences? So is a science not rather to be understood as a set of truths? And what does that mean, that concepts are fully determined elements? are then concepts judgments? Or so science should be considered not as a set of sentences, but as a set of truths. And we should also consider that science deals with, as Aristotle did, that science deals with objects of one kind. But this is not the case for Dilthey. And there is this funny point about from Hillebrand here, saying, well, then if it doesn't have to deal with objects of one kind, then there should be a science of the set composed of the Critique of Pure Reason, the Baedeker's Guide to Switzerland, and a few shorts and socks. So this kind of attack, it is, as I said, perhaps to be understood as a kind of ideological attack, but basically using the argumentative tools. So this is, perhaps it has an ideological motivation, but it is certainly conducted in a fair way. So now the sixth case is Stumpf's critique of Windelband in 1891. And since Windelband was quite an important philosopher, so Stumpf is not attacking Windelband directly, but he's attacking Windelband via Kant. So in his essay on psychology and the theory of knowledge, Stumpf argues against the distinction between matter and form of our presentations in Kant's critique. So he argues the fact that color qualities are arranged in space and that these same qualities may appear to us in a different spatial order does not justify the separation of space from the sensory content. The qualities appear to us in different intensities, and the different qualities can appear simultaneously in different intensities. And here he goes on with a point which I think is quite fair against Kant and also against Windelband. So with the a priori, Kant had to say and wanted to say something about the psychological origin of the forms of our intuition of thought, of our intuition and thought. He was not simply affirming its meaning for the theory of knowledge. He wants to say that the a priori concepts cannot be analyzed and that they are not given by our senses as contents of sensation. But, and this is the main point, but this negation of analyzability is itself a psychological affirmation. And this affirmation is just as evident as it is considered erroneous by most representative of psychology and physiology. In all cases, he goes on, we have here a new proof of the need for more accurate psychological claims in the theory of knowledge. So here again, I think this doesn't relate so much to the Boltzanian Hillebrandian strategy. This relates, I mean, what he has in mind, of course, or what is presupposed in Stumpf's attack of Windelband is the debate between Helmholtz and Hering. So it goes also in the way of the ontological parsimony at the end of the day. So now my last point is the critique of Marty against Völkerpsychologie, so against the against Völkerpsychologie. It's a hard term to translate. So Marty spent almost half of his life working or writing essays against Völkerpsychologie, and I think the half of the book Untersuchungen zur allgemeinen Grammatik und Sprachtheorie is actually a critique of Völkerpsychologie. So it was quite an important issue in his works. So in his dissertation of 1875 on the origins of language, what he tries to do is a critique of nativistic positions on the origins of language, a critique of the position that there is an inet connection between some articulated sounds and some intuitions or thought. So Marty is developing his position, well, the main argument of Marty against Wundt and Steinthal goes more or less along these lines. So following research in linguistics, anthropology and zoology, so one could first reasonably suppose that the first humans had primitive mental phenomena similar to ours and mastered the ability to perform voluntary movements. So you have to grant him this point, but it's not particularly difficult to do, because you can imagine looking at how children acquire knowledge, that the first humans, so to speak, were in a quite similar situation as small children, and that they developed, so to speak, knowledge out of so voluntary actions or voluntary movements, etc. So we don't have access. So if we do a science and the object of our science is not accessible, it's problematic. But we can also suppose how it is, just using by analogy with other situations, such as young children. So the second point of his argument is that since communication is the essence of language, the first humans most likely wanted to communicate their mental states, and by analogy, informations about physical events. So linguistic tools were then developed out of this intention, following different laws of genetic psychology, such as the laws of association and habit. Therefore, language developed thanks to mental acts and their unintended consequence, planlos, so without a plan, but aber nicht wahllos, not arbitrarily. So this distinction between without a plan but not arbitrarily is main attack against the approach of Völkerpsychologie. So he writes in his essay on Sprachreflex, nativism, and intentional linguistic construction, nicht wahllos, sondern planlos, so not arbitrarily, but rather without a plan or without an intention, ist also die Devise, welche hier auch in Bezug auf die Entstehung von Recht und Staat prägnant den Unterschied zwischen dem richtigen und dem unhaltbaren Empirismus bezeichnet. Wer die intellektuelle Grundlage dieses planlos zweckmäßigen Tuns klargelegt hat, der hat der Erfindungstheorie, so this is the critique to Völkerpsychologie, der hat der Erfindungstheorie, aber zugleich auch dem Nativismus, der in irgendeiner Form an fertige Instinkte appelliert oder die Entstehung der Sprache kurzweg als unerklärliches Wunder hinstellt, definitiv den Boden entzogen. So, when Völkerpsychologen are saying that they are doing empirical research, what Marty says against Völkerpsychologists is that they are just conducting a ill-headed kind of empirical psychology. And if you accept Marty's argument, then I think Marty has an important point against the approach developed by Völkerpsychologie. So let me now finish this very long talk about Austrian and German philosophy with a very short reflection on what is the result of all this. So what was the point, really? So, well, perhaps what these case studies show, I think, is that there is perhaps, but only perhaps, a homogeneous unity of Austro-German. And just to be sure that everybody got me right, I use Austro-German interchangeably as I use with Austrian, because I think my conception of Austrian is not a geographical conception. So it also includes philosophers that were not working within the geographical border of Austria. So Austro-German is just another label, perhaps more appropriate for what I want to refer to when I say Austrian philosophy. So there is perhaps a homogeneous unity of Austro-German scientific philosophy when we consider, these following moments of unity, which are not constitutive moment of unity, because they don't belong systematically to everything an Austrian philosopher would write, but they are quite, I think, good methodological aids, such as anti-Kantianism, this positive attitude toward argumentation, clarity, and the use of consistent definitions, a focus on clarity and a focus on some academic style, some empiricist sympathies, also some positivist sympathy, and perhaps, and this is why I proposed this distinction between realism and anti-realism, and perhaps also there is a generally realist inclination among Austrian philosophers. And perhaps we also may find a semantic tradition in the sense that Koffa suggested, but only locally, because of course what Koffa identifies as the semantic tradition is only just a part of Austrian philosophy. But I think what this case study shows, at least, it will allow us at least to eliminate one of these views, is that I think there is definitely no unity or no new era against, and I think this is one of the outcome of the case studies, is that it is very hard to speak of a new era as Richardson is suggesting. But there definitely is, or I could not say anything to support Barry Smith's thesis that there is no German scientific philosophy, because when you look at these polemics, of course, if the simple fact that these polemics existed presupposes that both sides were recognizing the other side as conducting a scientific philosophy. So I think Barry Smith's thesis is at least is not supported by the case studies that I presented here. So, and this is my last point, and just perhaps here to conclude what I wanted to do and what I wanted to suggest is perhaps just to put first the presupposition that I think is behind my reconstruction of my own position on the historiography of Austrian or Austro-German philosophy. So my presupposition is that one can't get an account of a period of history of philosophy without considering one point of view. So what I mean by considering one's point of view is that the problems we are dealing with today in philosophy are inherited from the past, so it seems to be relatively unproblematic. But taking that into consideration doesn't mean, so my second point, it doesn't mean that, or doesn't imply a reduction of past problems and debates to our point of view. So, and here I think this is where views like Martin Kusch's sociology of philosophical knowledge becomes interesting, because they may serve as a complement to an account in history of philosophy. So getting an account of history of philosophy in the way I'm suggesting may be also complemented by other tools such as SPK, the sociology of philosophical knowledge, or by considering the nature of philosophical institutions, or by using techniques that are developed in these recent years in history of philosophy, such as distant reading, or also using more technological tools as ontologies in history of philosophy, like the project in Indiana on Info, or any other complementary strategy. And so what are these moments of unity that I'm talking then about? So, and how do they relate to my presupposition that we should consider our point of view, and to my thesis that there are some moments of unity? Well, so this is my last point, and it is an open suggestion, of course, but it's after all just an analogy, but I think it is a speaking analogy. I think the formal moments of unity, such as style, semantics, anti-metaphysic, or realism, are determined by something which is there. And I think that the theses themselves and their relations are there. I'm not relativist on this, but these are moments of unity. We should keep in mind that these are what Meinong would call founded objects, or what these Gestalt that Meinong is talking about, where we have this bilateral dependence between our perspective at looking at the Gestalt, and the Gestalt as being grounded or founded in ordinary or single objects. So I think keeping this or trying to develop this analogy, this Meinongian analogy in the case of history of philosophy, could eventually, or in the case of history of philosophy, of history of German scientific and German and Austrian scientific philosophy, might be an helpful alternative to the views that I presented and criticized. Thank you.
The first, second, okay? I have just two questions. Pronto. Thank you very much, Professor Frechette, for this rich and comprehensive conference. I have just two questions. Professor Mario always says that the history of philosophy is essentially a philosophical history. And we can note this in the cases presented in your conference. Here is the first question. What is the relevance of this sociological, in a general sense, approach to understanding philosophy? What is the relevance? If there is a difference between philosophy and general culture of a people, I'm referring to the objectivity of philosophical knowledge, the objectivity. Is the object of this approach, sociological approach, philosophy or the general culture? This is the first. The second question, you say, Austrian philosophy is I quote, a useful label in order to distinguish an utterly distinct attitude regarding the position of philosophy in the realm of science. Distinct the position of philosophy in the realm of science. But in the position of science in the realm of philosophy, the other sense. For example, for transcendental idealism, Hermann Cohen, for example, mathematics does not have objects properly, objects, but is a method, infinitesimal method. And this method performs certain functions of the spontaneity of transcendental subjectivity. Science here does not seem to be an object for philosophy as epistemology, nor is it merely a model to be imitated in other spheres of object. But science, for Cohen, for example, is the objectification of the structures of reason, both theoretical and practical reason. For a realistic or positivistic, empirical or semantical point of view, I think of Austrian philosophy, the whole of science seems to be completely different. What's your common concept of science in this historical and sociological approach? Is there a common concept of science in this approach? For example, the whole of necessity in the science, the problem of relativism in the science. Is there a common concept of science in your sociological or historical approach? Okay. These are these two questions.
Well, thank you very much. It's these are good questions. First, I would just like perhaps to avoid a misunderstanding in my approach. I'm not really defending a sociological approach of this. I think that sociological approaches are important and that they are extremely useful, but my perspective or my take on this is not strictly sociological. So I think, as I said, I believe, so if to put it very in a bold way, I believe that there are objects outside independent of my perception, and I believe that there are moments of unity in a similar sense in what happened in the history of philosophy, and notwithstanding how I understand them. So this is my realist take. So
Okay.
I try to supplement this view with further specifications and further restrictions. So but this is just here just to perhaps to clarify a point where I think perhaps you consider that my approach. So this is my first question back to you. Do you consider that my approach is sociological for the reason that it for the reason that it considers, so to speak, case studies? No. Okay, that wasn't the case.
Sociological, in a general sense, is you say it's about Austrian philosopher and German philosopher.
Oh, okay,
Like,
okay.
To
Okay.
cultures, to
Yeah.
styles,
Okay.
institutions, different institutions.
Oh, okay, okay.
Different authors, this, and not just concepts, propositions, and this.
Okay, yeah. Well, I want to say, and I certainly believe that one defining feature of Austrian philosophy is certainly something like institutions, something like borders, something like education, because of course Austrian philosophers were educated with different textbooks in philosophy as German philosophers. So it's also, I mean, this all has its relevance in my perspective, but this is not what grounds, so to speak. This helps to identify the moment of unity, but the moment of unity are not reducible to these sociological aspects, in my view. This is where I do believe that we can conduct philosophy in a non-relativistic sense, okay? So now I'll try just to answer your second question, and I'm not sure if you're going to be satisfied with my answer, but you said, so Cohen's concept of science is the object. Science is the object of the structure of reason, or something like this. So
The science is a work of reason.
Work of reason, yeah. And so from this, you would suggest that actually the Neo-Kantians, for example, or Cohen, for that matter, would have a completely or a significantly different concept of science than what is suggested by the Austrians, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
A metaphysical concept of science,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, this is a strategy one could use. One could say, well, they're just talking about different things. And one of the views that I presented was also, and that I criticize also, is also following this strategy. So I don't think it's very useful, because we want to say that these debates or the case studies I presented exist,
Right.
that there were debates. And if the debates exist, then at least some of the concepts that these people are using are the same. Otherwise, the debate wouldn't make any sense.
Okay.
And I mean, the existence of the debate is, in my view, a good sign that they were using the same concept of science. Okay, there's a focus, of course, in Cohen on other defining aspects of what a science is. But I mean, basically, I think they have to agree that what we do in science is we investigate the structure of reality, and then how is that structured? For which reasons this is structured in that way is probably another story. But they do agree, or they do agree that science is practiced in the same way. So, well, not that it's practiced in the same way, but that it's basically the same investigation. Okay. So I'm not sure here about this. And now to your first question. So, history of philosophy is a philosophical history. Yeah. So I think it is certainly right. It is certainly a good characterization. And so your point here, or your concern, is that. But then, should we really bother to consider sociological cases as helping us to understand what was involved or what was at stake in the history of philosophy? Well, I mean, we'll just answer along the same lines as your second question. I mean, I'm not a reductionist in the sense that I would reduce history of philosophy to a set of sociological factors or features, but not considering them is it leads to quite astonishing mistakes, I think. And one of the mistakes I wanted to point out was the kind of strategy that is pursued by people like Schneidelbach, then just negating the existence of a whole field of philosophical research by simply saying, oh, well, it doesn't have the word philosophy in the title. That doesn't work. So, I mean, okay, I'm just a little bit exaggerating, but I'm very sensible to this kind of attitude. Perhaps that's the reason. But I just believe that using, looking at the non-philosophical history and looking at what was actually done in philosophy departments helps us to understand what was philosophy. And in this sense, I think it's probably one of the difficulties in accounts like Schneidelbach to simply say, okay, well, we're doing philosophical history, and let's put aside all historical or what you call sociological facts and just focus on this. And then we I think, remain blind to a large part of what is done in philosophy. So, but I'm not a reductionist, so perhaps if it can be a consolation, I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor?
Yes, thank you very much. In fact, my questions directly touch upon the questions of the commentator. So maybe I would like to push you a little bit more forward than you did until now. So yeah, for you, this Schneidelbach, Herbert Schneidelbach, is a kind of anti-program of historiography of philosophy. But I think it already makes clear that there are different types of writing history of philosophy. And there are not only different types of writing history of philosophy, there are also philosophical histories of philosophy and not philosophical histories of philosophy. So these several types, you also can put them in several categories, right? So this is rather complex. And for me, if you are thinking about this kind of problem, Austrian, German philosophy and so on, and also looking for approaches how to deal with it, it seems essential also to reflect what you now did a bit in the discussion, what your position as the author of this history regarding the methodic profile or methodological profile of your own history is. Now, and then it could be that certain approaches could be, so to say, re-evaluated. If you take the case for the case of Schneidelbach, because you don't like it. Now, assume, so, no, one remark before, and then you can maybe say, well, if you have at least a minimal claim that the historiography is philosophical or at least philosophically relevant, yeah, there is no way escaping the obligation to determine the concept of philosophy, which is leading your own reconstruction. Otherwise, it would not even be possible to qualify even one of all these positions as a philosopher. So you implicitly, you already work with the concept of philosophy. And this implicit concept of philosophy is the more your own historiography pretends to be a philosophical one, is to be made explicit too. Now the extreme case for this is, so to say, Hegel. He reconstructs the whole history of philosophy in terms of his own logic. So this is the extreme case, but that then is also the extreme case of a philosophical history of philosophy. Now we take, let's say, the lower case of Schneidelbach. In a way, you could say he presents a kind of Kantian approach. Kant has this famous formulation, nur der kritische Weg alleine ist doch offen. So there are some reflections on metaphysics and on empiricism, and then he says, well, this is in fact all invalid, and if you really want to advance philosophy, you can do it in one way, critical philosophy. Now this is an historical description, right? Now assume now, you as a systematic philosopher would be of the opinion that indeed Kant's philosophy is a very good philosophy. Well, then it would follow immediately that you could deal with history of philosophy in the way of Schneiderbach, regardless the fact that then from an empirical historical point of view, 80% of the philosophers would not even be mentioned. That would, from this perspective of history of philosophy, not be a problem. But for you it is a problem. So apparently you have another concept of the history of philosophy. So in this really thing should be made explicit, and then probably you can also reassess certain approaches. And this also concerns the content. For example, the examples you give, then in your own reconstruction. You try a kind of meta description of these 5 approaches, and this Kantian approach is then qualified as anti-realist, and you had this other realist. Now, you could also hold from this position, none of them is an anti-realist. They are all realists. They only are of the opinion that empirical realism is correct. In that sense, they are realists. But to understand empirical realism, you have to be an idealist. In that sense, they are idealists. So this seems to be a rather imprecise description. You could then also say, well, you have idealists and anti-idealists, right? So it needs to be a bit more precise here. The same issue, definition. One of your characterizations of the difference was the issue of definition. Now, assume you would be a Kantian. Well, for Kant it is clear philosophy cannot start with definitions. And if you are really a very good philosopher, at the end of your whole philosophical determination of a concept, you know what it is, and maybe there you can define it. So this already, from this perspective, would be an approach of an inferior philosophy. Last point, last example, case study, clarity style. It may sound a bit weird, but the older I become, the more I'm convinced that the most precise argumentative work I've ever read is Hegel's Encyclopedia. Now this is, so to say, an anti-example, so to say, in terms of clarity. So already here you see what kind of clarity are you looking for. And your example itself is very nice for Dilthey and Hillebrand, because, so to say, formally speaking, Dilthey is trying to define and is trying to be clear, but it doesn't satisfy the opponent. So, but you cannot say he's not defining, right? And from the other point of view, if we would ask Dilthey about Hillebrand, he would maybe say, well, what is wahre, tiefere Verwandtschaft? That does not seem a really clear proposition too. So what are we talking about? So all kind of contextual assumptions, determinations are brought in just because of the implicit concept of philosophy you're also working with, and that is okay. I would only say, you need to reflect that according to my point of view, and then you get a more, let's say, a stronger position with respect to what you do, which I think is very interesting.
Well, great. Thank you. This is very insightful, and I'll have to think about it a little bit more. But I can try to answer to your 3 points. So, well, so your first point was to say, well, there are philosophical works. It's my reconstruction. There are philosophical works which can be called philosophical histories of philosophy, and the fact that they don't deal with everything which happened in the time frame that they are dealing with is not a flaw, because it is philosophical. Okay, and what we do is just that we just completely assume that we have philosophical interests, and we just abandon the idea of doing some kind of objective history of philosophy, or we don't necessarily abandon the idea, but we're working something else. We're doing something else. We're creating a new philosophical work. Yeah. I mean, as a style, I must say, I think as a kind of work or as a kind of perspective, I'm very enthusiastic about this, and I didn't want to give the impression that I'm not. I think the best example that I'm enthusiastic, or to prove that I'm really enthusiastic about it, is that Brentano's history of philosophy, which I find extremely interesting, is exactly the kind of history that you're describing. That why bother on historical details? You just have to read Aristotle, and if you're clever enough, you'll understand everything there is to understand in Aristotle. And so given that Brentano is clever enough, or we suppose so, then he did. But I'm not. And so I'm trying to understand Aristotle using other tools. And I mean, I agree with you. I don't want to put into question the existence of this kind of work in philosophy, philosophical history, or philosophical histories of philosophy. But I think then again, at the end of the day, you cannot really consider them as historical work. You have to put them into this larger perspective of Problemgeschichte, or you have to put them in a. It becomes very difficult to get a perspective in history of philosophy as a neutral observer, starting with works such as these. It is, in my view, and it's my critique to Brentano, as well as your critique, as my critique to you, and perhaps to Schnedelbach, or to both of you, I don't know, but that as a kind of historical approach, because in some sense it is an historical approach, we don't want to deny that. As a kind of historical approach, it is elitistic, because it supposes that what the author sees is equally seeable by everybody. And this is just simply empirically absolutely not to be proven. And so then, in my view, if we go that way, then we should perhaps just abandon the idea that this is a kind of history of philosophy. So I would just put an emphasis here on the idea that, well, this is an original philosophical work which has a value for itself. It is a reflection on the history of philosophy, on the ideas, on the Problemgeschichte, but as a way of getting a picture of what was going on, it is not enough. Or it is just for the black belt master of philosophy, so then he can understand, or she can understand, but the starter in philosophy has no way of getting a grip to the problem. So this is my answer. I'm trying to be short on this. On your second point, on the distinction between realism and anti-realism, I think you're right. Many people from the Kantian tradition would just deny being anti-realists. But I also have this kind of discussion with phenomenologists that are transcendentalists. They will say, no, we are the real realists. Of course, and then what these kind of debates show is that of course, I mean, these labels are loaded ideologically. And so that's why I wanted just to use the label as an aid. So because I don't want to say that, oh, okay, so these are all idealists or anti-realists, and these are all realists. Because by saying this, of course, you take a stance yourself on what defines these positions. But perhaps even as an aid, it might be also confusing. So I take your point. So on clarity and style, I think that relates a little bit to the comment by Pedro on the fact that, well, perhaps they have just other definitions of what clarity is and of what science is. And perhaps, I mean, I would even go further and I would say, you're certainly right in one sense, because when they reply, when people like Dilthey reply, when people like Schmoller reply, they just don't understand what's the point, really. And Schmoller says something like, "Oh well, these Austrian provincialists, they are so sophisticated, and what do they actually mean?" So there was, perhaps I could temper my answer to Pedro in this sense by saying, well, perhaps they thought they were understanding each other, but at some point perhaps they will not. They were not, and perhaps then in this sense there's a sense of using two different concepts of science or something like this. But for my approach, and for a more general reading of these debates and how they structured also the development of philosophy, I think, I mean, there are also many evidences that they were understanding each other. I mean, okay, Kant couldn't give an answer to Bolzano, but Windelband answered to the Brentanian school. Windelband really, there was actually a debate. So they were actually, I mean, there are also proofs that they were understanding each other. So it's not, I mean, yes, there are elements speaking in favor of your suggestions, but I mean, on the other hand, if we have also elements showing that they are understanding each other, then I think it's enough for me. But thank you, yes.
Can you put up the last slide you had?
Yeah.
Oh, the one. No, that's this one. This one. So I'm quite happy to see that you're sympathetic to the same idea that I also champion. Okay. I've been doing this the last 5 years, which is the fact that there is one point of view and that we might profit from stuff that you quote in for. What I was curious about is whether, you know, I have my own answer to this question. So what I want to ask you is this. So there are two problems with using ontologies for this, especially the info stuff.
Right.
And that's because those ontologies are created to interpret them on the basis of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That's not done for history.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay? And the second point is ontologies are computer science construct that are controversial in certain quarters because they are static. Because, you know, they are supposed to be formal, and that's fine for me, but not so for other people. But they are shared. One of the debates is that, look, so Barry Smith is someone that has done a lot of work for the ontology of medical ontologies. You know, he thinks, and he has been very influential in that, there is one way to conceptualize the medical world or the medical sciences. You know, that this is history of philosophy. How, you know, would you react to these 2 points?
Right, yeah, it's a very good point. I think, yes, info is just an example, and I think, so I'm trying to develop so my own way of proposing an ontology for history of philosophy, and I think info is one of the examples I'm using, but personally I have also reservations about the project. Right, your point that ontologies are static, yeah, I take it. I mean, but on the other hand, what we describe is something, some existent object of the past, and so we want to say, or at some point we want to say that a static ontology would do in order to understand, for example, different phases in a movement in history of philosophy, not the whole history of philosophy, but just to take a slice. to identify central problems and to build the ontology, for example, based on the problems or based on the arguments, etc., etc. So here, I mean, I think I see your concern, but I'm not sure that it has a deep impact. Wanted to say just another thing, but that I forgot. Yeah, well, I think you wanted to add something, so perhaps it will come back.
So, well, I do think that what I'm suggesting, what I said, does have a deep impact, and you need a reply to that. Well, I have my own reply to that. So I published a paper in 2013 that's called Modeling the History of Ideas, where I propose a quite specific and quite systematic way to do this. It is a deep problem. You really, so in philosophy we are accustomed, for instance, to do this. I'll say something in my talk tomorrow morning, that, you know, it's okay to start, for instance, you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and you have, you know, the entry on one particular notion, say explanation mathematics. It starts with history. That's very specific to what philosophers do, and I'm very happy about that. But if you talk to historians of ideas, historians, what they think about historians of ideas is, oh, that's bullshit. That's something that Lovejoy did so many times ago. We don't do this anymore. So when we go into these kind of things, then we have to talk to other people, not just philosophers that that share these ideas, and that these questions are, we might think they are not deep, but they are, methodologically speaking.
Well, thanks for this observation. It's really helpful. What I wanted to add is that so the fact that the ontologies or models such as info is static doesn't so preoccupy. I'm not so preoccupied about it. Is that when I'm building the ontology, I'm also, and this is different, for example, from the perspective that Barry Smith's developing in his ontologies. What I'm doing is, so to speak, I'm using my own perspective, so I'm using also my own interests. I'm not saying that I'm really building an ontology of what there is out there, so like purely and simply. I'm building an ontology which also takes into consideration these moments of unity as being important factors. So if Christian Kreinen builds an ontology of Austrian philosophy, I think it would look completely different, of course. And in this case, but I assume that. I mean, I'm tainted by my own intuitions, and I assume that.
See you again.
Yes.
Nice to see you again. Well done. That's a very rich talk. I'm not a scholar about Austrian philosophy, but I am a bit surprised to hear that there are people denying that there are such a thing as Austrian philosophy, mainly after works like Roderick Chisholm or Rudolf Haller, Studien zur österreichischen Philosophie, which presented Brentano as the father of Austrian philosophy. I don't know if Bolzano should be considered as the father too, but maybe there are two fathers, I don't know. But certainly there is a huge contribution to analytic philosophy coming from Vienna, Austria as a whole, including Wittgenstein. But there are some common characteristic. I'm in doubt about realism because of Ernst Mach empiricism, and then the Vienna Circle program in philosophy of science. They are extremely important
Okay.
in the whole history of Austrian philosophy. But I would like to hear a bit more about people denying that there are some
Yeah.
something a thing like Austrian philosophy.
Okay, well, thanks.
What-
I think it's important to say a few more things on this. Well, there are these negationists. I think negationism is an ideology generally. So we see it in about the existence of concentration camps, and we see it about the existence of Austrian philosophy. So the motivations are normally strictly ideological in both sense. In the case of Reininger, it's also strictly ideological. So if we put these reasons aside, then there are the passive deniers, I would say, some people like Schnedelbach who just deny the existence of Austrian philosophy in a passive sense, in the sense that, well, I'm doing my history, whatever perspective I'm taking, which is justified, and well, I don't see it. It just don't show up in my on my screen. So this is not necessarily ideological. It could be, but it's not necessarily ideological. So I think like a non-ideological, a strictly non-ideological denying of Austrian philosophy is quite difficult, because I mean it would have to involve a position like I mean the Austrian state didn't really exist as we think it did, or then we would have to go then on the level of these historical facts or sociological aspects, and this is a bit difficult, so to speak. So I think it's probably the reason why, or at least I don't see here like deniers or negationists that would recur to this kind of argumentation. But my point in the ways I wanted to present the views is also so what I did was, okay, let's look at all these people writing histories of philosophy and try to systematize this in some kind of spectrum. And then the result of this empirical investigation of historians of philosophy led me to this result that, okay, well, you have like people that are saying that, well, there's only Austrian philosophy when we talk about scientific philosophy, like Barry Smith, and then the other extreme. But in the middle, in the middle, there is positions are difficult, because then then you find people like Koffa pointing at peculiarities that we find, but then they are not even Austrians, because Koffa is not dealing with Austrian philosophy specifically. So I mean, okay, there is perhaps not a strict negationist position based on facts, on historical facts, but when you look at, empirically speaking, taking all these histories of philosophy, the place of Austrian philosophy, just on the simple empirical review of the books existing, it's very marginal. And what we find, of course, I mean, perhaps it's also the result. This marginality might also be the result, and this is, I think, one of my concerns. This marginality might also be the result that people like Chisholm, people like Gilbert Ryle, were very early on referring to Austrian philosophy as the part of continental philosophy from the continent, the part of continental philosophy that was really exciting or really important. And so that by association, historians of philosophy from the 20th century just thought, okay, well, if it has anything to do with analytic philosophy, then it's certainly not part of our 19th Jahrhundert, of our 19th century. So, but I would have to investigate more here, because I mean, we have to go more in the actual histories of philosophy. But that's my impression, at least. So that perhaps one of the reasons for perhaps not a denial, but certainly a neglect of Austrian philosophy as not exactly relevant in 19th century because of this appropriation made by people like Haller, Chisholm, not necessarily Ryle, but certainly Chisholm, and then more recently people like Smith and even more contemporary philosophers in philosophy of mind, belonging to the analytic tradition and relating to Austrian philosophy. So it seems that, well, it was after all analytic philosophy, so okay, in 19th century it's not relevant. So perhaps it's the reason, but this is a sketchy answer. On realism, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, when we consider Marx empiricism, so how is that a position that belongs to the same set of positions as, I don't know, let's say Husserl or Reinach or even Brentano, right? So I mean, there's an important difference. I think it would be just basically the idea that I would define realism here in this very general broad sense that we're just able to describe what is given in our experience. We have this ability, and this is just something we can do, and it is not constrained by our conception, by our representations. This, I don't know if it's enough, perhaps not, but I think it helps us at least to put people like Mach and Brentano and perhaps even people from the Vienna Circle in the same boat. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Guillaume, for this very exciting talk. It's great that someone sticks his neck out and says a lot of controversial things that others can then respond to. I'm sympathetic to parts of it, but I want to push a little bit, since you kindly mentioned my work, I want to push a little bit the line what the sociology of philosophical knowledge might contribute to your specific issue. Great. Because the book that you kindly mentioned was not about trying to understand whether there were Austrian or German traditions in philosophy, kind of relevant to that question. But it seems to me that the sort of questions that I argue for that the history of philosophy should be raising may perhaps be relevant here.
Okay.
Okay, so a few things. First of all, when we had this phrase, the history of philosophy should be philosophical history. I think I would underline the history as much as the philosophy. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that history of philosophy, that it's worthwhile doing by the standards of our time, should have to be history of philosophy that lives up to the standards of historians. And mm-hmm. in particular, it should take its lead from the way the history of science is written. Mm-hmm. And if you compare the sophistication with which we write the history of science and the rather crass present centrism of most of the way in which the history of philosophy is written, it's rather depressing. Okay, so that's just the little credo up front. So now let me go into a few details. Well, one thing already came up, and this is the very term science. Mm-hmm. So when these people are debating today and when they were debating in the 19th and early 20th century about who qualifies as a scientific philosopher, of course, the first thing is to go back to the old chestnut of the demarcation problem and ask, well, what exactly do you mean by science? Because you will probably find as many distinct understandings of science as you find distinct schools there at the time. So we cannot simply take it for granted that we now know what science is and can then sort the guys of the past and the girls, whether they go with the science or not with the science. It just, we don't have that concept of science. So that's the first thing. Another thing that seems to me extremely important for writing good history is to be clear on the distinction between actors categories and analysts categories. So what are we trying to understand? Are we trying to use our concepts in order to resort the past? Or are we trying to understand the moves the historical actors were making with specific concepts? And that seems to me, with respect to this kind of question, absolutely essential. We are trying to understand what moves these people were making in the past in order to argue for an Austrian identity, distinct from Germany, or for a non-distinct Austrian identity. I think your Reininger case was spot on there, because there one can see that they were actually doing politics with that category, right? And it seems to me the sociology of knowledge would attune one to paying attention to that. And then, of course, one might just as well step back and ask, well, when then Haller and these guys are starting to argue about Austrian and German philosophy, what exactly was their context for which they were doing it? And there is an interesting history to be told about that as well. Okay, then the next thing that a sociology of philosophy would really make you pay attention to is to the patterning in the distribution of philosophical positions. So that one takes a close look at who were the guys, and unfortunately they were almost all only guys, and at least at that time, that were holding one kind of view, and who were the guys who were holding another kind of view, and can we detect any interesting patterns there? And then I have to put my cards on the table. It seems to me that nationality was less important there than religious confession. I mean, the distinction between Catholicism and Protestantism were certainly, for the writers at the time, more important than the nationality question. And you had people like Eucken, but also a whole range of other people arguing that there is a Catholic and a Protestant way of doing it. Kant, of course, being the Protestant philosopher, and it was frequent to align Kant and Luther, and people were writing texts on Kant and Luther. And on the other hand, they were saying Brentano, of course, is scholasticism, and therefore Catholic, right? That was an absolutely defining line for German philosophy at the time. But also let's be careful with the German, because partly these authors write at a time when Germany wasn't even yet founded. That was in 1871, and some of you guys were writing before that. But even after that time, people were, Einstein was a Prussian first and a German second. Your primary nationality was in terms of your land, and only secondarily in terms of the nation. And so you had different university systems. You had the Bavaria, and you had Prussia, and you had many others, and they played a very decisive role in philosophy at the time. And that seems to me an important pattern that one shouldn't lose. And of course, in partly, that correlates with the German-Austrian, the Protestantism, Catholicism thing. But of course, it doesn't align with it, because Germany also has important Catholic parts. Okay. What the else as well? So much more one could. Well, yes, one thing that seems to me important that sociological analysis would draw attention to, and this is phenomena of exclusion. You mentioned that in this quote, but it seems to me absolutely essential for the sort of way these historical actors were acting, but also then, and you showed this quite nicely with Schnedelbach, how contemporary peoples are acting. I mean, for example, Wundt. If I remember correctly, when I looked at the Schnedelbach book when I was writing about the psychologism dispute, Wundt is never mentioned in the whole book. If you look at philosophical histories, Überweg and others of the 1870s, 90s, 80s and 90s, most of them say the most important philosopher of our time in Germany is Wundt. Of course, not everyone agreed with that, but that was a perfectly acceptable thing to say at the time. And when Schnedelbach writes about this history, Wundt doesn't even appear anymore. So there's a classical case where, like, the winner writes the history. So in the psychologism dispute, people who want to do a naturalistic type of philosophy based on the results of experimental psychology lost that battle. Then they're written out of the canon. And then someone like Schnedelbach comes along and just naively reproduces that canon. And I think a sociological history will attune one to these phenomena of canon formation. And of course, then there's the question, and you raised this question, Pedro, is this what does the sociological thing teach us about that is of philosophical interest? Well, it seems to me the canon formation is one point where one can see that. Because it seems to me that a philosophy worth its salt should ask the questions, why do we think the way we think? Why do we have the intuitions that we have? Right? I mean, this could as well be a criticism of analytic philosophy as it could be of other traditions. That one naively starts from the intuition that one has, rather than asking, so what actually has shaped the intuitions that I have? And that seems to me a case where sociological analysis in combination, of course, with intellectual history, of which I don't see like that doing the one excludes doing the other. In fact, they have to be integrated in order to be relevant and interesting, seems to me of key philosophical significance. The last boogeyman I want to get rid of that stands in the way of this sociological understanding is a boogeyman that you yourself brought up in response to Pedro, which is the phenomenon of reduction. People always say, oh yeah, I want to accept the sociology, but I don't, of course, want to reduce arguments to sociological factors. Well, I think there we should do philosophy of science 101. What do we mean by reduction? There is, of course, a form of reduction where you exclude something from existing. So we might say we reduce the category of witches by saying there are no witches. Call that reduction by elimination. But there's, of course, also another form of reduction by incorporation or redescription, where we say something like, well, heat is mean molecular motion. When you say heat is mean molecular motion, you're not saying heat doesn't exist. Heat exists qua mean molecular motion. And so by analogy, when you say that the arguments over psychologism served a social political function, you're not saying those arguments weren't arguments, but you're saying arguments exist as moves in a social space. Arguments exist. We can reduce them to sociological factors in the sense that we can give them sociological redescriptions. But you haven't explained, you haven't denied their existence. And it seems to me that when one is confronted with objections, you know, does the sociology explain the philosophy away? I think it's useful to remember that reduction doesn't need to have that consequence. Sorry, I've given more of a speech than
well, great. Thank you very much, because it's very helpful, and this is exactly actually what I was expecting, giving this talk, what I was expecting as a background. So this is very helpful for my project. So on reduction, sure. Of course, I mean, I don't want to dispute that. By using sociological methods, you don't want to deny the existence of the argument. And the way I see it is also in the exact same way. But it might also, so it does. You don't have to deny the existence of the argument, but you want also. There's something in the reduction by description, by redescription. There's something in the reduction by redescription that gets lost, I think. Perhaps I'm wrong, and then you can correct me, but it's the meaning of the argument, like the philosophical meaning of the argument. Don't you think so?
No. Why would it be? What is an argument?
Okay. Yeah, but let's say for example, take Husserl's critique of psychologism. So there perhaps is, we can look at the effects of this argument on different other positions, but we can also look at the place that these arguments have in Husserl's system and the meaning that Husserl's attribute to these arguments in order to develop his position further. And so here I think when we are considering that, then we have to suppose that we are superimposing our understanding of Husserl on Husserl's own development. And by doing this, this is my point in my first in my first presupposition, and I think by doing this, even I think in the case of the reduction by redescription, I think we need something more than the reduction by redescription. So that this is why I mean I also said to Ariana. So I'm assuming here my position that as an historian of philosophy, I cannot be perfectly neutral on what I'm analyzing. So this is what prevents me, in my view, it's perhaps not the best defense, but it's what prevents me of going all the way into sociology of knowledge, because I assume that I have philosophical intuitions or I have philosophical preferences, and I will be selecting among them. I will be selecting my object of study among them, and so. But this is not exactly what I wanted to say, because I agree with your distinction between reduction by elimination and reduction by redescription. So, and the further points are very helpful, and I quite agree. I think also there's plenty of things that we can that we can find in investigating from a sociological perspective, and I think also, like the question of confession can also help us, or the political situation can also help us to understand why a certain philosopher suddenly turns from an anti-Kantian to a Kantian. There were cases, for example, the Jewish students of Brentano. There's this student Bergman who tried to get a position, an extremely clever philosopher. Was convinced by Brentano's idea, by Bolzano, but being Brentanian and being a Jew it's a killer. You cannot have a philosophical career. So I'm not saying that, and he didn't want to convert. So I mean, from Judaism to Protestantism. So, taking this into account, when we want to understand why he turned around 1914 into a Kantian philosopher, so just looking at the internal motivations, reading the text is not going to give us the picture, because you have there a Jewish philosopher, a Zionist, and a Brentanist trying to get a job, and it's simply not working. So you have to do something about it, and then you do concessions. And I think. So the sociology of knowledge helps us to understand something like this, and I think this phenomena is widespread, or more widespread than we think it is, from a naive philosophical perspective. So yes, I perfectly agree, and this is, I think, the kind of elements that I would like also to include in this reconstruction, but also considering that it is so. I think the position, perhaps you will not agree, or perhaps you will, the position that you are defending, I think, is a kind of metaphilosophical stance over on the debate. We could frame it that way in some sense, that you're not taking side. You're looking at these polemics, and you're looking at the way they were conducted and the factors that were determining them. I want to do this also, but I believe that so this is my concession, perhaps, to Christian Kreinen on this view, is that I'm still doing an history of philosophy with some motivations that are, there's some parts and parcels of ideology, perhaps, and I don't want to deny that I have these parts and parcels, or these parts and bits of ideology in my view, but I think still I can try to get the picture, to get the account in an objective way. So what I'm trying to do is to concede something from Barry Smith's position, something from Koffa, and to complement this account with data from the sociology of empirical knowledge. But and then this is my reaction to your distinction between reduction by redescription and reduction by elimination. I'm not sure that the distinction is enough for me, and so that's why I'm not going all the way to sociology of philosophical knowledge. Not sure if it's satisfactory, but it's my defense.
First of all, thank you so much, Guillaume, for your excellent presentation. I also have a kind of meta-philosophical question. It's somehow was motivated by Mario's sentence that the history of philosophy is itself a form of philosophy. I am a bit skeptical about this idea. I mean, history of philosophy might be philosophy, but it might not be philosophy too, and that's a problem. In that sense, what I wanted to ask you is to stress a sort of comparison between the situation of 19th century philosophy with the situation in the 21st century philosophy. You mentioned several issues as the existence of debates, the understanding of each other's, moments of unities. I mean, it is clear that at that time, when we take a look at the main figures, they were discussing with each other. They knew each other's work. They even knew, they even had a background in science, many of them. I mean, not only in psychology, but in physics and mathematics. They had like a very broad, not only philosophical, but scientific background. My question would be, how do you see that from the standpoint, from a perspective in the 21st century, where we have been discussing about that, an extreme level of professionalization in philosophy. I mean, nowadays it is impossible for somebody to be a physicist. Well, we have a physicist here, but a mathematical and philosopher. But even if we consider philosophy itself, it is quite complicated because we have this typical concept of continental analytic, but even within those traditions, there are really very difficult things. And if we consider, for instance, continental philosophy, we have phenomenology, we have Heideggerian phenomenology, we have 19th century philosophy, we have several different approaches to philosophy. And of course, we have an enormous amount of information at our time. I mean, we have critical editions from all these philosophers, and not to mention the enormous amount of secondary literature that we have to read in order to be engaged into a philosophical community. And I have the impression that nowadays we live in sort of monads in which Kantians meet and Aristotelian meets and analytical also in their groups. And I see as quite problematic to speak nowadays about the unity of philosophy. I don't see that there is even an interest in order to get to a unity. I mean, to get to a common interest or a common understanding between all these different monads that are in different academical space. In that sense, I have the fear that we might be only doing a very professional, but in any case, history of philosophy.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a very interesting point, and I think if I can summarize it in some way, so what you wanted to say is that there is a difference. That people had different backgrounds, scientific backgrounds in the 19th century, but they were able to understand each other, perhaps because the advancement of science at that time was not the one that we have today, which implies today quite an important amount of specialization or professional, well, specialization I think is the correct term. But, and so, perhaps your suggestion, I'm anticipating or I'm speculating on what you had in mind, perhaps, but your suggestion is that the model that we are using when we are looking at the history of 19th century philosophy would have to be different than the model we will have to use by looking at 20th or late 20th or early 21st century philosophy. Is that one of the things that you had in mind? Because, well, perhaps a short answer on this?
No, for instance, you mentioned the fact that, I mean, you pointed out how Brentano did history of
Right.
philosophy. I wonder if nowadays it is possible to do such
Oh,
a
yeah, okay.
history
Oh,
of
yeah,
philosophy
okay,
in
okay.
those terms. I mean, to speak about those movements, metaphysical, ideological, and
Right.
because of your specialization and professionalization, which it's required in current academic fields.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not so a disparating situation, if I can say so, because you look at many of the books that are published in at Oxford on analytical ontology or analytical metaphysics. They are still formulating, the very basic Aristotelian question, as if nobody would have never written a word about this in 2,500 years of philosophy, and it's still philosophy. And I think, and I don't take it to be a negative, or I don't take it as a pejorative description. It's just so. I think the way you are right. There is a certain level of specialization today that we have in philosophy, and especially in philosophy of science. We have someone working in philosophy of climate science at our university in Salzburg, and this requires, of course, quite a high level of specialization if you want to conduct such a research. But there are still domains in philosophy, at least in analytic philosophy, but certainly also in continental philosophy, where this level of specialization doesn't play a role, and it's still philosophically relevant. And so I don't see here, at least from this perspective, a shift of paradigm. But I take your point that, of course, specialization makes the picture quite different today as it was as it was in the 19th century. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I would like to take the opportunity maybe to advance the discussion we have now on what is historiography of philosophy and how to do it a bit further. Because of the credo of Mr. Kusche at the beginning, it's very interesting, but I also think much telling, or maybe helpful to reflect a bit on it. So, of course, it's really clear. If we talk about a book like Schneiderbach, there is a lot of things are missing, and even what's maybe even worse, what is standing there is in very important respects not correct. So this is for sure not the model. But the suggestion that we have to emphasize when we talk about the history of philosophy, we have to emphasize not only the part history, but also have to take as a methodological paradigm or example the history of science. We can, on the one hand, it sounds very sympathetic, right? But we can also ask what is excluded by that approach from a philosophical perspective. And to me, it seems the main argument, let's say, with respect to a reduction to such a position, not with respect to an addition, but reduction, that is that the relationship of systematic philosophy to its history, so the relationship between philosophy to history of philosophy, is different than the relationship between the non-philosophical sciences to their history. But this, of course, is already a philosophical argument. It depends already from the concept of philosophy. You think it's a plausible concept, but in the let's say this whole idealist tradition of philosophy, this is, so to say, the standard argument for distinguishing, or at least emphasizing also the necessity for a philosophical history of philosophy, and not only an historical history of philosophy.
Oh yeah, okay.
As you want to have yourself. So indeed, then it seems to be, if we reduce a history of philosophy or historiography of philosophy to what is suggested, then that in particular this specific relationship of philosophy to its own history from a systematic point of view doesn't play a role anymore. So, and therefore, I think, regardless of the disadvantages or what is missing in this approach, there also is a kind of systematic argument not to reduce to, so to say, an historically over-based history of philosophy. And this argument, of course, in short, is just that philosophy is about foundations, or expresses a kind of totality function, and therefore it has an intrinsic relationship to its history, because they are all competitors. And the only possible legitimacy for a contemporary philosophy is to do things better, and that is to integrate history of philosophy. So therefore you get this whole idea that the systematic philosophy from an historical point of view is always an integration of the whole history of philosophy. Now, and now if you're going to write this history, you cannot write it, so to say, without this philosophical perspective. But again, this is also depending on the concept of philosophy you have. So this is itself a philosophical discussion, and you cannot reduce it to standards of today or something. That is an empirical argument, which is not sufficient, I think, although important.
Yeah, well, I will just react very shortly on this. Is that I grant you that point, but it probably will be difficult at some points. I mean, it could be objections that, well, then, if you do the history of systematic philosophy, then you have to engage with the dogma of the system. And so you're doomed as an historian, because you have to be systematic. You have to be also on the level of the analysis. You have to accept the value of the system. Yeah, but this is quite in a position. So I'm trying to be somewhere in between Martin and your position, but these are quite two extremes.
Well, can I just say a word on what my position is? My position is not that all engagement with texts of the past should take the form of the kind of history that I was sketching. So that's clear. I wouldn't have written about Wittgenstein on rule following if that was all I thought was to do the kind of contextual history that I was suggesting. But what I would say is that this engagement with certain important text from the past that one engages with in order to do better systematic philosophy is not best described as doing history. To me, this is taking a text from the past in order to do systematic philosophy. That is perfectly all right. One can do this with Aristotle, one can do that with Wittgenstein, one can do that with Trendelenburg. But to call this systematic engagement with the text of the past on our premises, or on our auxiliary hypothesis, as Brandon, we heard on the first day, presents it, I just wouldn't regard this as history. Well, Problemgeschichte is a tricky beast, because different people mean different things by it. If by Problemgeschichte you take it on this kind of Windelbandian model, that there are like permanent problems running to the history of philosophy, this to me is a mongrel. This is not meaningful. This is neither meaningful history nor meaningful philosophy. So that would be ruled out. Yes, that would be ruled out on both philosophical and historical premises. Yeah, so that I would say.
Good.
Thank you very much.